Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Alice Hogue, and I'll be presenting Chapter 20, Fundamentals of Federal Outer Continental Shelf, or OCS Title, on behalf of the National Association of Division Order Analysts. This was authored by Lisa Shelton-Jobert. I'm hoping I'm pronouncing her last name correct. And I will be doing the presentation. Now, to start off, I just want to make sure that everyone's aware of why we study offshore leasing. And that is because offshore leasing provides the United States with currently with 27% of its oil and 15% of its natural gas. Now, that may not sound like a lot, but the estimated reserves then, the undiscovered plays, are estimated to provide 60% of the oil in the United States and 41% of the gas in the United States. So this is where there is a lot of oil still left in the ground. And so it's very important that we study what is the Outer Continental Shelf, what are the laws relating to the Outer Continental Shelf, and that's why you have this topic in your materials. So let's look at our agenda for today. We're going to start with, I'm just going to define the OCS for you. It's actually a scientific term, and I'll talk about the definition and give you an idea of what we're talking about. Then we're going to look in the introduction at how these laws derived, what statutes implemented these laws, and then we're going to look at what bodies of water are state jurisdiction versus federal jurisdiction. From there, we're going to look at the OCS. That is the creation and purpose of the Outer Continental Shelf and how it's actually monitored by the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management and how the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management organizes these different areas, the different parts of the continental shelf. And from there, we're going to look at OCS leasing. OCS has a leasing program that's got a 5-year plan. You have to qualify to be a bidder, and then we'll talk about how you become a successful bidder, and what your your lease description will look like. From there, we're going to look at OCS Title. That is the different types of interest that you can own in an offshore lease and how those interests are tracked. And then it will go on to talk about how you would examine the title and the applicable law. It also goes on to talk about how sometimes state jurisdiction applies and sometimes federal jurisdiction applies as far as the laws go. And so we'll get into those distinctions. So let's begin with looking at what exactly do we mean when we refer to the OCS, or the Outer Continental Shelf. And as I said, this is a scientific term. It's basically the shallow areas around the coast of cities, or states or countries. And it's a shallow portion of it. It's no part is greater than, I would say, 500 feet. So it's basically defined as a shallow extension of that landmass adjacent to the shores of a particular state or country. So then let's look at how we came up with how we were going to monitor leasing in these areas. And we basically came up with 2 laws. These were both enacted in 1953. And it just says how jurisdiction over the Outer Continental Shelf is derived. The first law that was enacted was the Submerged Lands Act, and it was granted to the state. So up to a certain point, the state owns in the Outer Continental Shelf, and then beyond that point, the jurisdiction belongs to the federal government. So basically what these 2 laws did was designate which parts of the OCS belonged to the states and which parts were granted to the federal jurisdiction. Now, these are governed by Title 30 of the Code of Federal Regulations, Section 250 and 256. So if you want any clarification about these things, I would recommend that you just go into your website or your internet and just type in this Title 30, and it'll give you how all these laws came about and the different regulations regarding them. Okay, so what those 2 laws are basically saying is that the state has jurisdiction over the Outer Continental Shelf from the coast to a distance of 3 nautical miles, and then the federal government has jurisdiction beyond those 3 nautical miles, extending 200 miles out to the sea. Now, as an aside, and this is not in your text, but it says 3 nautical miles except for Texas and Florida, which have 9 nautical miles. But for the most part, generally speaking, most states have jurisdiction to 3 nautical miles out on the outer continental shelf, and beyond that to 200 miles out to sea belongs to the federal government. So the states manage off of their immediate coasts. This is a graph that I saw off the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management site, and I thought it was really a great way to talk about what these different jurisdictions are. So what it's saying here is that basically from the shoreline to a small part, basically enough land for you to dock your boat, belongs to the private owner of the land. And beyond that, so from the coastline to 3 nautical miles, that belongs to the state. Beyond that, 200 miles beyond that, or 200 nautical miles behind that, it belongs to the federal government. So this is basically what this slope is, all the way out to 200 nautical miles. Another way to look at it is, I thought this was a great diagram. This, I don't know if y'all can see my pointer here. Grab a pen. So this is really the part that we're talking about, the outer continental shelf. Up to here, 3 nautical miles around here is going to belong to the states. And then after that, this belongs to the federal government. And as I said, this is considered shallow water. It's no deeper than 500 feet. And then when you get out past it, there is actually a shelf. It actually dips down. And when you get past that, that is what's called the high seas or the territorial waters. And the jurisdiction for that area is the United Nations. So the states and the countries have jurisdiction up to their outer continental shelf. Beyond that, it is considered the high seas, where it's territorial waters, and the United Nations own that. But most of the drilling that we're talking about is going to be done here and not here. You can imagine how difficult it would be to sink a well in this kind of depth. So we keep it here. This is where most of the oil and gas is, we believe anyway. Okay, hang on. All right, so now let's go on and look at the OCS. The Outer Continental Shelf is, according to the United States Constitution, Congress was given authority to manage the public lands. Congress delegated that authority to the Secretary of the Interior, and the Secretary of the Interior manages several federal agencies, including offshore leasing. And these are these different agencies. So it's the U.S. Department of the Interior, or the Secretary of the Interior, and under this federal agency are other federal agencies like the Bureau of Land Management, the United States Geological Society, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, and the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. That is the federal agency charged with monitoring leasing in the Outer Continental Shelf. Now, there's another agency that's tied to all of these. It used to be known as the MMS, or the Minerals Management Service. Now it's known as the Office of Natural Resources Revenue. And that is the body that collects the rent and revenue and bonuses for all the federal lands. So that is formerly the MMS, the Office of Natural Resources Revenue. Okay, now there's also other agencies, the Coast Guard and the EPA oversee activities related to the Outer Continental Shelf, especially as it relates to environmental issues. Now this is relevant because the laws and regulations of these other agencies must also be considered when determining the applicable law. So you might have to look at, when we're talking about Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, an issue, we may have to look to the Coast Guard for those issues. We may have to look to the EPA rules and regulations. So it's not enough that you know the rules and regulation of the BOEM. You have to know the rules and regulations of other state agencies or other federal agencies that are affected. Now, the BOM has divided the OCS, the Outer Continental Shelf, into 4 regions. Let's take a look at those regions. They have divided it into the Atlantic Outer Continental Shelf, and this is representing the actual shelf. This is federal government, except for the part immediately around the states. This is the Gulf of Mexico region of the OCS. There's also a Pacific OCS, and there is an Alaska OCS. Now, only 3 of these regions have hydrocarbons that we know of. That's Alaska, Atlantic, and the Gulf of Mexico. Now, these administrative procedures are going to vary depending on which region you're in, but for the most part, most of the oil and gas drilling is in the Gulf of Mexico, and they have the most established policies and procedures. And often these other regions will rely on the policies and procedures of the Gulf of Mexico as kind of the gold standard for how they want to set up their policies and procedures. But just keep in mind that each region has its own set of rules and procedures, and they have many different sources of laws, regulation, policies, and procedures. Oh, and by the way, these many laws, regs, policies, and procedures change with some frequency. So you really have to be on your game in order to stay in touch with the different rules and regulations. But now let's look at leasing in the OCS. Now, as I said, most of it is in the Gulf of Mexico, and the OCS further divides the Gulf of Mexico region into planning areas. There's the Western Gulf of Mexico planning area, the Central Gulf of Mexico planning area, the Eastern Gulf of Mexico planning area, and these planning areas are further divided into blocks. So I thought this was a really good map here because it shows you like if you look at along the Louisiana coastline, it's 3 nautical miles is where the state has jurisdiction. But if you look at Texas, it's 9 nautical miles. I thought this was a good map to show how Texas actually has greater jurisdiction into the Outer Continental Shelf than does Louisiana or Alabama. Florida has the same kind of state jurisdiction, the 9 nautical miles. Okay, now each of these areas, these planning areas, are further divided into blocks. So here's the planning areas, and then they're further divided into tracts or blocks. So what we're looking at, as you can see, by far the greatest amount of drilling is being done in the central planning area, but there's also quite a bit in the western planning area. But what the BOEM does is then it divides these different planning areas into separate tracts of land, or separate blocks is what they call them. And each block is assigned a number. And none of these blocks exceed 5,760 acres. So when a lease is awarded, it covers a specific blocks. And as you can imagine, the BOEM has extensive maps governing this. They maintain the lease data, and so they're going to have maps that are pretty clear about who owns what. This is a poster of a map that I saw from Offshore Magazine that shows the Gulf of Mexico as a network of drilling leases, pipelines, and other oil and gas infrastructure. That's what these blue lines are here, and these red lines are just different pipelines. But each green area represents a block that represents an oil and gas lease. So that's how it's divided out. So now let's look at how you go about leasing one of these blocks. This is just another diagram showing you the different blocks. I don't know if you can see that, but each of these has a number on it. So that's how you decide which you want to drill on or get a lease from. Now, what happens is the leasing program. Now, this is the way you take a lease in the Outer Continental Shelf is there is a bidding process. There's actually an auction. And you go to the auction. I've actually attended one of these auctions, and it's just like, selling Sotheby's art. People have their little tweak of the nose or raise their hand or whatever, and you're basically bidding on a bonus payment that you're going to pay for a lease in this certain block. But before that happens, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management prepares, and this is under the OCS LA procedures, they prepare a proposed final or a 5-year plan. And it says, okay, for the next 5 years, this is where we are going to drill. So from 2012 to 2017, this is our 5-year plan. So it shows the 5-year proposed schedule of leasing by region. And the block cannot be leased unless it's included in the schedule. Now, I just went to this BOEM website and found this document showing the leasing schedule. I'm going to show you that here. And this tells you what the sale number is and the area, and then the year that that is going to go for sale. Now it goes on to say what the timing and location is of each sale. It's listed along the schedule, and then it also gives you the steps that you need to complete. You have to be approved in order to bid on these OCS acreage, and so it gives you the process of how to go about leasing. Normally speaking, annual lease sales are conducted in the western and central. You'll see that's the majority of this is Gulf of Mexico. There are very few other planning areas that are covered by scheduled lease sales. So as you know, the majority of OCS leasing and development is in the Gulf of Mexico. I don't know what this Chukchi Sea is, or Cook Inlet. I believe that's Alaska. But as you can see, most of it is the federal government. Okay, now you have to have certain qualifications in order to bid on these leases. And first of all, you have to be a lawful citizen. That is, you have to be either a U.S. citizen or national, a lawfully admitted alien, a private or public U.S. corporations, and a private or public or an association, a United States association. So we don't let other countries lease our offshore lands. It's limited to United States citizens. So what the BOE does is once you qualify, first you have to meet this qualification, the lawful citizen qualification, then you're going to have to post a bond. And the reason we want you to post a bond is because if there are any damages in the Gulf of Mexico, we want to be sure that you have the financial stability to meet whatever obligations come about as a result of leasing from the OCS, paying your bonus payment, paying your delay rental payments, making sure that you have all the safety equipment that you need in order to drill in the Gulf of Mexico. So we are going to require you to have a bond before we even let you bid on an oil and gas lease. Now, there may also be additional bonds. For example, the operator is going to have to post a separate bond. There may be other bonds that are required along the drilling process, just again to make sure that you can meet your lease obligations. So once you meet these qualifications, you are considered qualified to hold an interest in an OCS lease, qualified to basically do business with the federal government. So let's look at what is actually awarded. As I said, the lease covers a single block. An example that the author has given you in the book is Block 389. Once you have that lease is given its own unique OCS serial number, and the OCS identifies it on a leasing map, keeps their records up to date as to who owns the record title for which lease. So the lease, an example would be the lease would be awarded effective July 1st, 1996, given the OCS serial number, OCS-G 16906, and it will be described as all of Block 380 at Water Valley, OCS official protraction diagram. This is just telling you what map to look at. OCS official protraction diagram NG16-1. So the successful bidder is also known as the record title interest owner. Now when we're talking about title to OCS leases, the ownership can either be as the record title owner or as an operating rights interest. So you can convey part of your interest in certain depths, and that's known as the operating rights owner. So let's look at this distinction between the two ways you can own in the OCS, record title and operating rights. Well, record title, as we just said, if you were the successful bidder in the lease, you are considered the record title owner. But you can also, if you're the record title owner, you also own operating rights. And these operating rights can be conveyed to other parties. Now, that has to have approval by the BOE. Everything has to have approval. So If you're going to assign it to someone else or you're going to grant operating rights, that has to be approved by the BOE, and they have an assignment approval form, and all those regs and policies have to be followed. But operating rights are defined as interest held by a working interest owner that has a horizontal depth limitation. So if you want to convey a certain depth of your record title rights, you can do that by granting to other parties, other working interest owners, your operating rights. Now, the BOE only recognizes two types. You can only have shallow and deep operating rights that you can convey. So let's look at how this works. This is a great example that you have in your materials. I think starts on page 6. But she's just trying to demonstrate for you the distinction between record title and operating rights in an OCS lease. So she starts with, I'm sorry, this is on page 5. So she says, Company A is the sole successful bidder at a lease sale of an oil and gas lease covering Block 123, South Marsh Island area, Gulf of Mexico region, and given serial number OCSG 12345. Now, at the time of the award, A will have 100% of the record title interest. And even though we don't say it, A also has 100% of the operating rights, meaning they can convey their operating rights to other parties. So what A does is assigns 50%. Again, this is going to have to be approved by the BOA using certain forms. They're going to convey their 50% record title to B. So now A owns 50% record title and B owns 50% record title. I don't know if y'all can see that. B owns 50% record title. Okay, and B owns 50% of its operating rights. So now B is going to farm out that interest to C, and he's going to limit it. If you drill C to a depth from the surface to the deepest depth drilled, we're going to award you our operating rights in this lease. So when that happens, let's say then C drills to that required depth and they earn the farm out agreement. And so in that case, the ownership is going to go, A has a 50% record title interest and B has a 50% record title interest. C now owns A operating rights. And then what happens is A and B, and by the way, this well is drilled by A and C. B is out of it. A and C drill the well, and again, your operator is going to have to file a bond. There's going to be approvals in order to do that. So then A and B then convey their interest from the surface, from 7,000 feet to and including 20,000 feet. So that is another grant of operating rights. This is shallow. This is the shallow operating rights that can be conveyed. And these are the deep operating rights that can be conveyed. So as a result, the way the ownership looks is A has a 50%, B has a 50% record title interest. He conveys C, his operating rights in the shallow depths, and then A and B convey their another operating rights interest to D in the deeper depths. So the final ownership is going to be record title is going to be still in A and B 50% each. B never conveyed his record title interest. He only conveyed his operating rights interest. So he conveyed his 50% operating rights to C. So then the operating rights are going to be owned by A, who gave 50% to D and kept 50% of the operating rights. And then C, 50%, that's 50% operating rights here. Sorry, that is, get rid of these marks. That's 50% here from the surface to 7,000 feet. And then D is going to own 100% of the operating rights. A conveyed to D 100% of the operating rights from 7,000 feet to 20,000 feet. If you'll just keep in mind that the record title owner owns 100% of the record title and 100% of the operating rights, and that they can convey all or part of their record title and all or none of their operating rights, then I think you're going to be okay. But the distinction she's making here is that there's different types of ownership that are tracked by the OCS. Now, these leases are maintained on the website, and the lease files are managed by the adjudication unit. And but they're really only monitoring record title, who owns record title, and who owns the operating rights. Now, as far as liability goes, no matter who the interest is assigned to, everyone in the chain of title is going to be liable. So just because B didn't drill this well, he farmed it out to C. If C goes bankrupt, the federal government can go against B. So everyone in the chain of title remains liable. And so that's just to make sure that we can take care of the financial obligations that arise. Now, she also talked about other obligations that arise, and those are called decommissioning. That's on page 7. And these are called decommissioning obligations. And that is, these obligations arise, there's a list on page 8, if you drill a well, if you install a platform, pipeline, or other facility, if you create an obstruction to other uses of the OCS, or become a record title owner in the lease or of the operating rights, that triggers your decommissioning obligations, or become the holder of a pipeline right-of-way on which there is a pipeline platform, or F, re-enter a well that was previously plugged in accordance with the regulations. If any of these events occur, then the person involved is going to be held to an obligation to decommission those wells. And decommissioning just means that they are going to take the next necessary steps to abandon those pipelines, to remove those abandoned platforms, those abandoned wells, so that if there's a hurricane, you're not going to have all these empty platforms out there. They're going to get swept up in the hurricane and do all kinds of damage. Plus, for environmental purposes, you don't want those just standing out there rotting. So there are obligations. If you take an OCS lease or receive operating rights, you are going to be responsible for any decommissioning obligations that may occur as a result of those actions. Again, each succeeding owner remains liable. Now, all these regulations are spelled out in, if you go to the Gulf of Mexico OCS LA website, in what's called the Leasing Guidelines Handbook. And that just basically provides the nuts and bolts of how to interact with the Gulf of Mexico regional office. So a lot of that information, I think probably that the author got, is coming directly from those sources. Okay, so now let's look at examining OCS title when we're looking at the state's records. One thing that really struck me about this paper that I was looking at was that she said there's really no single source document that will tell you all the instruments in a BOE lease. So the regulations permit you to file with the BOE, but if you really want to get a full picture of the ownership, who owns a net profits interest, who owns an overriding royalty interest, you're not going to be able to get it just by looking at these records of the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. And so there's also another file that they talk about in here that's the non-essential files, non-required documents files. That's on page 7. So that's another source that's going to include assignments of override. Those don't have to be approved by the BOA. Net profits, interest, mortgages, all that kind of information is going to be in these non-required documents. But those documents don't have to have approval by the BOE. So what she's just trying to point out is if you're examining OCS title, you have to look at more than just the records of the BOM. You have to look at these or just the ownership records of the BLM. You have to look at these non-required documents, and you have to look to sometimes the state the state laws. Even though the federal government has liability, sometimes to really get a full picture of the ownership, you have to look at the adjacent states' records. Now, there's a whole issue about which state's records you're going to look at, but basically an example was they had an operator's lien that was filed in a parish in Louisiana. And so you would have to go to that parish and look up those records to find that operator's lien. It wasn't filed in the records of the BOE. So they're just saying that, you know, it may not be enough for you just to look at the documents of the BOE. And then it gets even more complicated, like, okay, now we know it's going to be Louisiana, but what parish in Louisiana are we going to look for these documents? So that's why it's difficult to examine title to OCS. Really, the leases and the operating rights, those are easy. Those are crystal clear. I mean, the BOE tracks that. They put maps together that track that. But the full ownership picture, you're not going to get unless you delve into these other types of documents, including the adjacent states' records, to have that full interest. Now, another interesting thing about the adjacent states' records is that the government recognizes that the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act is not going to cover every possible situation that could arise. And so what they say in their procedures is that if there's a gap in the OCSLA law, if there's some kind of gap that doesn't cover a certain situation, in that case, federal law, we can look to the adjacent states' records. So if there's a controversy, now we can only apply state law if there's a controversy that arises on an OCSLA site. Federal maritime law is inapplicable, talking about different injuries, and ship laws, federal maritime law, if it's inapplicable, and the state law does not conflict with federal law. That's kind of tricky because you're saying, well, there is no federal law, but there's got to be, you know, if it directly conflicts in some way, then you can't apply the state law. In other words, they're saying federal law still controls, all right? But if there's a situation where you don't have the law, the federal law does not cover it, we'll allow you to apply state law. So you have to figure out, okay, and this is in cases, this could be both civil and criminal laws of each adjacent state, and you would have to look to those states' records in order to sort of fill in the gaps. And again, she talks about how difficult it is to determine adjacency, which state law to apply can be difficult. At one point, there was a requirement that there would be outward extension so you could know, okay, state law applies in this region to Louisiana, in this region to Mississippi, etc. But that was never done. So now they have to kind of look on a case-by-case basis and decide which state is adjacent, quote unquote, adjacent. So that is the other issue when we're talking about OCS title, is that state law may apply if there's a gap in the federal law. Okay, so in conclusion, she says that finding the ownership interest of an OCS lease might first appear to be a straightforward, simple exercise. But if you really want to get the full picture, you have to look at state laws, other policies and regulations, and basically, in order to do anything on an outer continental shelf, you have to look at the federal and state laws and regulations and the files and records of all of these jurisdictions that were mentioned. So that is the conclusion of our presentation. Let's look at what we talked about today. We started with an introduction, and in the introduction we basically just defined what the outer continental shelf is, and we said that that was a scientific term. And then I showed you a map where you could see the actual outline of the outer continental shelf around the United States. And then we said that these laws came into effect, the Submerged Lands Act and the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act. They were both enacted in 1953. And basically what they're saying is who gets jurisdiction, the state government or the federal government, depending on how far out, how many nautical miles out you are. Then we talked about the OCS itself. We talked about how it was created, what its purpose is. We said it was part of the Department of the Interior, and then it worked with other federal agencies like the Natural Resource Revenue, formerly the MMS. And then we talked about how the OCS organizes their properties. So we talked about that they have 4 different regions, Atlantic, Pacific, Gulf of Mexico, and Alaska. We said by far Gulf of Mexico is the most extensive. And then we looked at the regions, and then they were further divided into the planning areas, and then the planning areas were further divided into blocks. So then when we talked about OCS leasing, we said there's a 5-year plan that they have to publish, and I showed you a picture of that 5-year plan. Then we talked about the requirements to be considered a qualified bidder. Basically, you have to be a lawful citizen of the United States or a lawful corporation of the United States, and you have to post a bond. Once you do that, then you're considered qualified to do business with the federal government, and then you can then bid on these OCSLA leases. So that is the leasing process. And again, as I said, it's just an auction. It's usually held in New Orleans. It's the one I went to. And, you just basically just like a Sotheby's art auction. You're basically bidding on what bonus payment you're going to pay. And then as far as the next thing we covered was OCS Title. And what we said here was there are really 2 types of title interest that are tracked by the BOE, and they are the record title interest and the operating rights interest. The record title owner being the successful bidder, and the operating rights owner being someone that's conveyed an interest in a depth, either a shallow or a deep depth. And of course the BOE tracks all of that. Then she gave you a wonderful hypothetical where she showed how they conveyed 50% of their record title, and then conveyed 50% of their, or 100% of their operating rights to a certain depth, and then how you could break those different interests down. And then we talked about examining title to OCS leases, and we said, look, you've got to look at a number of different resources. If you want to get the full picture, you have to look at what this non-required documents file that the OCS keeps in addition to the lease files. And then you have to look at even the state's jurisdiction. You may even have to look at different documents that are filed in the county records of the adjacent state to really get a full picture of what the ownership is in the Outer Continental Shelf. And then we talked about the fact that the federal government recognizes that not every situation is going to be covered in the OCSLA. And so they said in those areas where there's a gap and the issue is not regarding maritime law and it doesn't conflict with the federal government, then in that case you can apply the state law, the adjacent states laws. And again, she raises the issue that how do you know what the adjacent state is? It's not crystal clear. No one's ever drawn lines that said, okay, this is all Louisiana, this is all Texas, etc. So that's just another issue you have to look at when we're talking about OCS title. And that concludes our presentation today. And in closing, I just want to remind you of the words of Benjamin Franklin, who said, the only thing more expensive than education is ignorance. So I thank you for coming and learning about OCS title.